Which one? Are you going to call the meeting? Ron.
Still feels like it.
If I could get your attention, it's 7 o'clock, and I would like to call the meeting, the joint meeting, the Planning Policy Commission and the Development Commission. So we're officially called to order.
Great, thank you. I'm going to switch directions here a little bit because you're pointed that way. So glad that all of you could make it out here today. My name is Kristen Leeson, and I'm a senior planner with the Development Services Department. Tonight we are here to talk about how we will update and approach updating and developing new architectural standards for Old Town. So I'm going to walk you through a little, oops, let's see. There we go. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the project background, how we got here, the areas that this would apply to, any engagement that we've done thus far. We'll talk about the updates to the existing standards that we have in place, and then we'll talk about discussions that we've had about potential new standards for the single-family duplex district, which would include all structures in there, single-family and duplexes. And then if we have time, we'll bring up some other topics like gateways and accessory dwelling units and additions. So there's a lot to talk about tonight, and if we can't make it through everything, that's okay. We're happy to come back and continue the discussion. That's not a problem. I want to let you know kind of too why you're here. PPC has become very familiar with Old Town between the update of the Old Town sub-area plan and the Old Town Land Use Code amendments that are in process, and will ultimately be making a recommendation to City Council about these standards. And the Development Commission went through the Central Issaquah architectural standards process. So you're familiar with how it works, what to look for, how to implement, what kind of works for developers, and the commission and staff and can help us through that part of it. So that's why we brought you all together. This is the very first night that we've talked about it with you all. So we'll see how it goes. Wrong way. There we go. So for those who have not been involved since the beginning, I'm going in the Wayback Machine. In 1999, we adopted the Old Town Sub-Area Plan. It was not touched again until 2009, when we were asked to remove any references to the bypass. So that's all that was done. In 2013, we finished all of our work, a 7-year process on developing a Central Issaquah plan and a Central Issaquah development and design standards. So by 2014, council said, enough, we need to go back and focus on Old Town. And they put forward 3 council goals. 2 had to do with traffic and circulation in Old Town, and 1 had to do with Old Town vitality. So in 2015, Mayor Fred Butler appointed a task force, and they focused primarily on the commercial areas of Old Town and came up with recommendations. The recommendations included, number 1, update the Old Town plan and the Old Town design standards. 2, create a consistent and well-designed streetscape for Front Street, and work with the Downtown Issaquah Association to help them increase partnerships with community groups and regional groups. So we continue to work with DIA. In 2017, we adopted a downtown streetscape plan that's slowly but surely being implemented. And we are we did the Old Town plan, and now we're working on the design standards and some code amendments. The Old Town plan, during that process, we held 4 public meetings. We took it to council. Council saw the task force recommendations. City Council said this is great, but we need a little bit more focus on residential because it's not talked about at all. So when we began updating the Old Town plan, there was a lot of focus there because there had not been before. So we had 4 open houses, 1 online survey in which we got over 450 responses, and then we had 6 Planning Policy Commission meetings and 6 City Council meetings. Part of the plan, we have our goals, our policies, our vision. We also had implementation actions. One of the goals said we want to maintain the traditional character and scale of the cultural and business district and sunset neighborhoods while allowing them to still grow and evolve. Policies were update the CBD development and architectural standards, and update the multifamily high development and architectural standards along East Sunset Way. In the plan, we included an action plan. First action item for under immediate actions. There are 3 different ones: immediate actions, short-term actions, and longer-term actions. Under immediate actions, it said new architectural standards and design guidelines in CBD, MFH, which is multifamily high, on East Sunset Way only, and single-family duplex zones. So currently, we have design standards, Old Town design standards, which apply to the areas that you see here. Does this work? It does. So they apply to the cultural and business district right here, multifamily high district on East Sunset Way only. They also apply to the multifamily medium district. So you may recall when I'd said the implementation actions and the policies did not include updating MFM. But right now, our plan is to leave that in there, thinking it was an oversight. We plan on leaving that in there unless we hear otherwise. So we're just going to include it as part of our conversation for now. So this is what our standards look like. They were adopted in 2000 or 2001. 2001, they were updated. This is what they look like. They cover things like windows, roof lines, articulation, walk-throughs or pass-throughs, and that kind of thing. Those really just need to be refreshed and updated. The Old Town Plan also says to preserve residential neighborhoods. Preserve the scale and character of the residential neighborhoods while ensuring a variety of housing that meets the community needs. The goal, adopt architectural standards and updated development standards consistent with the character and style of existing residences. Again, the implementation action says to do it for the single-family duplex zone. This was picked because this is really where the oldest part, the Issaquah oldest part of the township was located. And it has this grid system, and it feels like it is connected to the cultural and business district and the multifamily streets. That is why that was selected. So should we do include single-family duplex? That is all of the goldish area that's here that would be included in the standards. So outreach. On August 29th in 2019, we had a stakeholder luncheon. We had 9 people attend. It was a pretty good mix of property owners, business owners, and residences, people who lived here. And we talked about both things. We talked about the CBD and multifamily. The outtake from that was that the standards are pretty good right now. What we have is good. They address the right elements. They need to be updated and refreshed. We also talked about single family. With single family, the biggest concerns seem to be with the recent increases in height and bulk are the primary factors that affect character. They like the idea of diversity in the neighborhood, but they want to maintain the residential Old Town's eclectic character that's there. On January 11th, on a very cold, very rainy and windy day, we had about 40 people show up for a walking tour and a workshop. It was really fun. While we were there, we made a brief presentation, and then we talked about these different elements, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. They all met in smaller groups, and then at the end of the presentation got up and talked about what they thought. And this is kind of how it played out there. This is what they worked on. So I am going to hand it over now to our consultant, Samantha Souther, who's with Meta Urban Design. She has done this type of work before, and she's going to walk you through the workshop. She's going to walk you through some of our thoughts on the existing standards and then what we heard from the workshop. And we'd really like to get your feedback tonight on, are we headed in the right direction? Is this something that can be implementable? Does this do what the plan tells us to do? That's what we're looking for tonight, okay? All right.
Thanks, Kristen. Whoops. First of all, I'm really excited to be here, so thank you for welcoming me back. I think this is a great community, so I'm happy to be part of this effort. I think it's really exciting, so just wanted to start with that. So Kristen talked about, what can't hear me? Is that better? Thank you. Kristen talked about what we're doing. I want to give you a little more insight into how we're approaching this effort. So the primary objective is we want to have a final document that is usable. We want both staff to be able to implement it, and we want applicants, property owners, to understand what the regulations are. That's the primary objective, what we're doing here with this effort. To do that, we're going to tweak a few topics. Kristen mentioned that there's a zoning code update that's in the process right now, so we want to ensure that the new standards are in alignment with the new zoning updates. Also, we want to make sure that we're not getting too down the weeds of having guidelines versus standards. So without going on a tangent, standards are very cut and dry. It's a yes or no. It's do this, not that. Guidelines can be a little squishier, a little more subjective. So at this point, we want to go down the path of having something that's really cut and dry. Again, this goes to the implementation focus and the usability aspect. Especially with the single-family area. This is uncharted waters for Issaquah. No other single-family area in the city has standards right now. So that's why we want to take a step in that direction, see how it works, and then the plan is within a year to revise them and update them if needed, potentially add new guidelines at that time or recalibrate depending on how these new standards are received. Let's see, and finally, part of the creating a usable document is freshening the document. So Kristen showed you some pictures of what it looks like now. There's been a lot of changes just in the profession in the past 20 years, so we want to make sure that it's in alignment with what we see throughout the country in terms of best practices for standards and guidelines. Does this make sense from an overall perspective of what we're trying to do? Okay, great. In your packet, we included an outline. And from the highest level, most of what you see in that outline is not new content. It's taking the existing standards and reorganizing them in a way, again, so it's more usable for the both staff and the end user. So on the screen, you can see the gray box, purpose and applicability, and then part 1. All that is existing content. I'll go through a couple tweaks to that content in the next couple slides. But the biggest change for part 1 is instead of having a chapter for the CBD and a chapter for multifamily, we're separating those into 4. So there's a general site design, general building design, and then specific standards for CBD and multifamily. So if you're familiar with the existing standards, you're probably aware that about half of the guidelines are repeated between CBD and multifamily, but there are some minor inconsistencies between the two, and that just is as you update the document over time or as you're drafting it, if you have the same standard in 2 places, it can get kind of complicated to make sure that they're saying the same thing. So that's what we're seeing is just kind of a best practice to avoid that repetition, only say something once and then have some cross-references. And then again, I think the most exciting part is this new content that we're talking about, which is part 2, and that's shown in pink. We'll talk more about that in a moment. So I'm just going to march through these overall chapters for part 1, and I'll point out the topics that need some refinement or some tweaking, just so you're perfectly aware of what's changing and what's not changing. You'll see the topics in pink are the ones I'm just going to highlight as we march through the outline. The first one is gateways. So in the plan, it talks about having these gateways, and then the existing guidance in the standards, I think needs a little revisiting. So if we have time at the end of the presentation, we'll talk about that in depth today. If not, we'll come back and have a deeper conversation, because we want to make sure that we're getting that topic right. The second one I want to point out is the landscape elements. Kristen mentioned that there's a streetscape plan. We want to look at both of these documents together to make sure that they're working together. Again, we don't want them to be in conflict. And since the streetscape plan is relatively new, we want to look at the section in the guideline, in the standards that has very similar content and make sure they're saying the same thing or that they're supporting each other. We don't want to have conflicts. We don't want to have redundancy. We want to make sure that each tool is kind of functioning as needed. So that's something we're going to look at as a group. I think, biggest topic for staff in terms of challenge for implementation is color. So that's a big topic we want to get your input on today. This is some pages from the existing standards right now. So it talks about how to use color, has some of these, a narrative explaining why this is important to Old Town, and then how to use it in terms of having a primary and secondary color. But then if you want to figure out what colors to use, you actually have to go into the planning department and you have to look at these boards. So that's pretty difficult, both for staff and for applicants to figure out what colors are allowed to use. We had a good laugh when we looked at this. So what we heard when we had the stakeholder lunch is that the colors aren't a problem. It's just how they're being implemented and that communication between staff and the applicant. We want to make sure that the process is easier for everybody to use and there's no ambiguity. So this was just taking, eyedropper of the existing palette and tiling it up here just so you could get a better idea of what we're talking about, because this is pretty hard to understand, even for us looking at it. Another thing that we heard from the community is they want this to be updated and looked at more frequently. So I think that what we heard was probably every 5 years or something, they want to revisit the color palette just to make sure that, depending on how development trends are going, that the color palette is in line with community priorities and values. So just to orient you, we have the allowed colors. These would be allowed for what we're calling primary, so just the cladding of the building, or trim or accent features, and then the roof colors, which it's kind of hard to see on this projection, but there are some reds and some blues in there. But then at the bottom are the prohibited colors, which the standards talk about neon and metallic colors they don't want to see. And again, this applies to the current CBD and multifamily area. I think the last topic that we're tweaking is scale and massing for CBD. Part of the land use update or the zoning ordinance update is to lower the height. So right now buildings can go up to 60 feet. So the current standards have above 2 stories. You have to do these upper story setbacks. So I believe every story above 2 feet, your upper floors have to be set back 6 feet. So what we're thinking makes sense is to do away with that, because now instead of going up to 60 feet, you can only go up to 45 feet. And instead of, how many stories was it before?
Stories before, but now, so it was 65 feet, sorry, correction. It was 65 feet with the step backs and 45 feet, I believe, as a base. And now what we're proposing is 40 feet maximum height.
So,
or 3 stories, whichever is shorter.
So that's why we think the upper story step back tool doesn't really apply anymore based on that zoning update. Then lastly, in terms of multifamily, once we reshuffle some of the topics to move some topics into the site design and the building design, this is what's left, and we're not proposing any updates or tweaks to the existing multifamily districts. Before I move to the single family topics, do you guys have any questions or comments just about the overall organization and the approach? All right. So again, the single family standards would apply to that gold area. And this is the single family duplex zoning, but as you're moving around Old Town, it's the single family neighborhood area. I know sometimes that can be confusing. And this applies to new construction, and we expect it will apply to some additions and possibly renovations. But we want to get your input on where exactly do we want to draw that line. If it's a small, modest addition, do the standards need to apply, or are we talking about if most of the house is changing, is that when the standards need to apply? We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And again, this approach, we're calling it this slow burn approach, where we want to start first with the most important topics, identify what is most important to the community and to you all, and to write really clear, strong standards to ensure that that happens, and then revisit it in a year to see if there's any refinements or any other guidelines we can add to that. These are the topics we talked to the community at the meeting. We simplified it into these 3 buckets: overall size and shape, scaling elements, and then the site. So pretty much everything but the building. And I'll walk you through these and explain what we heard from the community and then what we're planning on doing with the feedback. So in terms of architectural style, we went on the walk audit and we looked at the range of houses throughout the neighborhood. And this is why I think Old Town is so great. It's almost this gallery of houses, of American architecture. You have the older pioneer style house down through the beautiful Craftsman, some really great mid-century examples, and then you can see some of the newer construction has some of those odes to these earlier styles that we see. As a project team, we were looking at different styles and tried to see if there was any one predominant style of architecture. And we realized that the predominant character is that it's eclectic. There's a mix, and that's really cool. So as we talked to the community about that, what we heard is that they don't want to regulate style. So I know some of you are familiar with the central Issaquah standards, where it actually regulates a style. You must choose one of these. What we heard is that in Old Town, that's probably not appropriate because it's so eclectic. But the community wants to focus on the most important aspects to maintain the character. And I think the biggest thing we heard was that massing is probably the most important tool to maintain this character. People want to prohibit, just having a really big box like this. And they'd rather see something with a little more nuance, a little more variety in the overall shape. So we talk about that in terms of scale reduction or mass reduction. In terms of the standards, we're working right now to figure out exactly what does that mean. How wide can your building be before you need to have a shift in plane? How long can your roof be before you need to have an accent gable or something like that? Those are topics we're exploring right now, but I think having some of these standards codified is in line with what we heard from the community. We also talked about roof types and looked at a variety of precedent imagery showing multiple different types of roofs, steep roofs, shallow roofs, and everything in between. And what we heard was the only thing that really doesn't fit in are flat roofs. And what we heard is that flat roofs are more in line with this modern architecture. And while these are really great and beautiful examples, it's out of character with Old Town. So we heard pretty clearly that people want to prohibit having flat roofs. We talked about materials, and some standards get really specific in terms of materials. What we heard was that it's not so much the actual material, whether it's wood or cement board or metal, but it's more the appearance and then having durable materials. Those are the priorities. And people want to allow flexibility to ensure that we're not creating standards that are overly burdensome for people. We want to make sure that the suite of materials that people can choose are cost-effective and practical. So color, again, this is the one topic that I think we had the widest range of feedback from the community. Some people said, nope, don't regulate it. This is a community of artists and we want to celebrate that. Other people had a little more feedback in terms of, perhaps we want to explore limiting the amount of colors or prohibiting the really bright neon or fluorescent colors. So we looked at the color palette, or how the central Issaquah regulates color. And without going too much down that road, basically it allows earth tones in central Issaquah, but anything but the pure hue. So as long as you have a little bit of white or gray or black into the color, as long as it's a little more subdued, you can do it. So that might be something we want to explore. That might be a balance between, letting people have fun with color without overly regulating it. Some specifics that we did here with color is that, especially for doors or some accent materials or trims, people aren't too concerned about allowing some of these brighter and wilder colors. And people thought that this might even be fun to let people, express themselves this way. Whoops. In terms of having these bright colors as the primary color of the house, I think this is where we got a little more of that mixed feedback. So again, this might be where we want to explore preventing those overly bright, or the basic hue of a color, and you have to have something a little more subdued if you're talking about the primary color. And I think people, for the most part, said that they'd want to avoid this multicolor kind of, rainbow treatment of a house. While this might be appropriate in some places, it might be a departure from the character that we see in Old Town. So this could be a relatively easy thing to regulate by saying, if you have a face of a building, you can't have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different colors. We might say you can do 1, possibly 2 for the overall cladding color. In terms of windows, what we heard was people don't want to overly regulate size or detailing or style, but they do want to require some windows and doors on that street-facing front of the building. Sorry, I keep getting a little explanation. So we looked at, we can regulate amount of transparency, and people thought that might be a little too much detail for Old Town. In terms of driveways and garages, I think we got pretty clear feedback that if there's an alley access for the lot, that people want to see the vehicular access. They want to see the driveway and the garage facing the alley. So in this little drawing, the garage is in pink and there's a driveway going off the alley. People want to ensure that this is the character because they want to emphasize the street front and the character of the street and that human-oriented design. Knowing that Old Town has a lot of variety and nuance to the block pattern, there are some lots that don't have alley access. So in those conditions, we talked about what is the most appropriate way to have garages and driveways. And we heard that these 2 examples on the left are probably the most supported examples, where the garage is either set back behind the house, so as you're standing on the street or the sidewalk, it's not, you're not perceiving it so much, or it could be part of the house, but you still have, a nice porch entry or a, human-oriented design feature that feels more prominent to the house. We heard that this example, where the garage is the first thing, it's in front of the house, seemed to be out of character with what people want to see. So I think people want to discourage that when possible. We talked about front yards and the size of front yards. So I'm sure you guys are familiar with the zoning requires a 10-foot minimum setback from the sidewalk. But when we walked around and looked at houses, we saw that there were some blocks that have a very wide range of setbacks. So you can see some that are, right around that minimum, some that go up to 45 feet. And then there are some blocks, so for instance, this is Alder between 3rd and 5th, that have a pretty consistent setback. So most of the houses on this block are set back about 45 feet from the sidewalk. So we talked about whether or not this matters, if people want to preserve this character. We got some mixed feedback. I think some people felt like this was more important than others. I think what we did here is if people wanted to preserve this, to still allow some sort of flexibility. For instance, if more than 50% of the houses on the block have a consistent setback, maybe your house, must be set back within 5 feet either direction or something like that, I think is probably in line with what we heard. In terms of front yards and landscapes, people, I think this was probably one of the most important things, is to ensure that there are clear sidewalks from the sidewalk, or clear walkways from the sidewalk to the front door, and then front doors facing the streets. There were some groups in our discussions that wanted to require front porches. Some people wanted to encourage or incentivize it. I think requiring it might be a little too far, but I think it's noteworthy that some groups thought it's that important that that's something to discuss. In terms of fencing, people didn't want to overly regulate fencing. They thought, whatever you want to build your fence out of is fine. The main thing we heard was they didn't want to see privacy fences, so fences above 6 feet. They didn't want to see those between the sidewalk and the building. So with zoning right now, as long as it abides by the setbacks, you can legally build those. So they want to ensure that you see the building, not the privacy fence. And then in terms of natural elements and pervious surfaces, so right now zoning allows up to 50% impervious. So in theory, per zoning, you can pave your front yard. We heard that people want some sort of natural elements in the front yard. They don't want to see a front yard that's completely hardscapes. So that's the summary of the single family and kind of what we're thinking about doing with those topics. Do you guys have any thoughts or comments about that before we move on to these other two topics?
Was there anything that was mentioned that you said there's no way, especially, DC, since you've worked with this kind of thing before? Is there anything that we talked about that you think there is no way that the city could regulate that or enforce those things that we brought up? And I just, quick note, for those who are here that are part of the audience, there will be time for audience comments as well after this, so you have time to speak as well. But is there anything in there that you said this isn't enforceable or this isn't manageable, or why would you do that? I mean, we want your input too. So,
Hi. Not so much unenforceable or a great problem, but I want to focus on what was said about guidelines versus requirements. I think in the existing standards, you have something like each section is broken into required and recommended. Is that right?
Encouraged, yes.
Encouraged, right. So just wanted to mention that in the Central Issaquah Guide, our parallel for that would have been appropriate and inappropriate. And I think in general, we found that it was useful to have the inappropriate sections that were more like guidelines, really, than were like hard requirements. Okay. If you don't include the guidelines at all, I wonder if you might include some of that information up in the intent section, because I think we found that it was helpful to be able to have some guidance there, more than simply the prescriptive requirements.
Yeah, that's a great comment, and exactly what we're doing in terms of guidelines for the existing ones, I think we still need to figure out, because there are some that have those encouraged statements, but once we get into the meat and the specifics, we're definitely going to want to make sure that we're calibrated correctly, so that's really great feedback to have. All right, I'll move on to the other topics.
I think there's one more.
Yep.
Good thought, I guess, on the building materials. It sounded like you said you wanted to leave that open and not regulate those. And then brought up the question, okay, if somebody came in and said, I want to do a plywood-faced house or something, and does that just fall under eclectic then, or Or if you're trying to regulate roofs and colors and everything else, can you leave that open and have it work? So.
Yeah, we want to make sure that, we want to create some, barriers, and I would say that plywood probably isn't that durable of a material. So we'll have some language about, making sure it's, can hold up over time in this climate and that kind of thing. So I think we'll have enough guidance in there to deny a plywood house. But I like the way you're thinking.
Yeah, and I did have some phone calls, and there were comments at the neighborhood meeting where there were concerns that if we, excuse me, regulate materials, that they don't want them to be expensive. Totally on board with that. But we do want to make sure that we want people to be able to stay in their homes for a long time, so the more durable the material, the longer that that's going to last. So it's a balance. But, yeah, good point.
So here's another point to that. I grew up in Lake Marcel, Duval. There's quite a few log cabin houses. Would those be appropriate in Old Town? I wouldn't think so. And that is durable material.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Is log cabin a style? Or is it a material?
I mean, you could probably say it's both.
It's a style,
Yeah, yeah.
But cedar shake is a further extension of that question of saying, even if it fits something that people find pleasing, is this what we want to have in the community, which is kind of how some of these discussions got started. For me, you start to say a lot of things about being eclectic, giving room, but on that same tone then, with setbacks, you start saying, well, we're going to regulate it by street. I mean, I think that some of your decisions have to be a little more broad. You can't say, on one street we allow this, and then on another we don't, and still have an eclectic, we want people to feel comfortable in this artist community. So I'm seeing some conflicting thoughts right now, and I think that goes to that point of materials of saying, either there's something that doesn't fit this vibe, or we're going to say, no, we want to see what we get, and then see, are we getting a lot of issues, and then go back to it, which kind of then defers back to the whole point of why we started this. So I do think there's some cleaning up that needs to happen as far as the do's and do nots. Right now, it's a little bit loose, and then you start to say, except that if you're on this street and we're going to have this exact guideline, well, if someone wants to put pavers and it looks very nice and they have a fountain and they decided this is where their kids are going to ride their bicycles, but someone else prefers grass, that's their property. I mean, you need to have very clear lines of saying this is or isn't okay, in the sense that it is going to breathe and have a life, and you have to allow those homeowners to be able to do what they want, in a sense. So having the do nots is very important, because that allows the do. I mean, by having it vary so much on one hand, but then not in another, I think it's a little tricky.
Yeah, that's a good point. So how would you guys respond to the log cabin? Do you think that should be allowed, or do you think that is out of line?
I would think it shouldn't be myself.
I think it's out of character from
Yeah.
what we've seen.
Yeah.
But I can also see cedar shake being used as an accent on a wall in a way that looks very nice. I'm thinking of the home that's over at the Circle, over on the lake, that was built in the last couple years, that has a very beautiful feel that I don't know that we would say this is not allowed. And if it isn't, then it needs to be very specifically called out, just the same way that we did when we, in our other guidelines. But it doesn't sound like we're going that way with it, with Old Town. So you have to be able to say, we are going to be more eclectic with that, and this is what will then be okay.
I guess the point that I'm trying to figure out is we're talking about having an eclectic part of town. That's, I guess the word artistry was used. Yet when I drive around, it seems much more uniform than that. So where is, like, to Joy's point, where is that standard? Because again, I don't really know. When I drive through it, I see much more of a uniform, older part of the city. But when I hear eclectic and artistry, I think of, Lombardy Street and streets like that, where it gets.
You don't think of a natural color tone palette?
I guess I think more of like, Capitol Hill, places where it is actually prominent, much more prominent.
Murals, a lot of different
Correct.
ways to display that. And I think too, even in your modern examples, hearken to older architecture, craftsman style, and things like that. So it's easy to say that we don't want something that's boxy, flat roof. That's a good start. But your modern examples hearken to a vintage vibe, which really gets to the heart of what we want to preserve in Old Town. So maybe we need to think about how do we preserve that? And that is with those guidelines, rather than saying, well, we hope that you do it this way.
And I would think color would play a large part of that, a big part of that.
Materials.
Yeah, material.
So you're thinking having more specifics in terms of allowed, or would you want to go down the road of encouraged materials or allowed versus prohibited?
I remember from our multiple meetings on these topics, we found that the community really supported limiting and calling out what was and wasn't okay. We didn't find that there was a movement from the public saying, there's too much, we're being stifled. We found it was the opposite. People were not liking the new developments that we were getting. So I would lean more towards exploring how do we define, rather than, again, that kind of concept of less guideline and more saying this is what you can and can't use. But that, again, being said, is that it's very important that we keep a character without pricing people out of homes. We want to keep Old Town affordable, and we want people to be able to age in place as well. So if you need to take out your steps and put in a ramp, that should be allowed. It shouldn't say, well, that, your steps were grandfathered in, but now there's a separate code and you can't do this or that. We want to make it more affordable for people to age in place, and that means having some looser standards with how something is facing the street, for instance.
That's great.
I'd
Any
like to
other
make a
thoughts?
comment on the materials too, to Jason's point about the log cabin. It would be easier, I think, for us to tackle the do-nots than the do's, because we don't know what the future trends may look like, because as they are emerging, but we do know what we do not want in terms of materials and standards. And if someone does approach that boundary, to have maybe a review of that, because maybe it would be appropriate to have a log cabin style home in Old Town if it's designed in a way that looks very similar and is eclectic, but it matches the neighborhood, right? So I don't want to necessarily say you can't absolutely have this style, but if it approaches that, then maybe you can go in for a review and say, okay, we can look at that. But in terms of building materials, I know that there are some building materials used up in the Highlands. I don't think would be appropriate for Old Town, because they just don't hold up. And these are developers that have said, these materials will hold up, no problem, and they're failing. So I think we need to be very careful about articulating what doesn't work for Old Town, so we don't get this stuff into Old Town and have it devalue our properties.
Yeah.
Also, in the Central Issaquah Guide, we did break down into appropriate and inappropriate sections for each section that we had, and we found, I think, that it was easier to specify the inappropriates than the appropriates.
So what would you guys classify as inappropriate? If you could.
I don't know if stucco would look good. I mean, stucco, I guess if it's done appropriately with gables and it could possibly, but I would think stucco might be something that would look a little out of uniformity in Old Town.
I like your statement regarding durable materials and natural materials, and there's a sustainability plus there in terms of the durability of the materials, so that's a good statement. I felt a little uncomfortable about the vinyl siding example I saw up there.
The siding?
Yeah, I think that was a vinyl siding example in
yeah.
one of those.
I think stucco is a great example of a material that may not be as durable, because a lot of it is dependent on the application process by the contractor. So it involves a lot of quality craftsmanship. I also want to comment something about mentioned earlier regarding porches. I would probably, my personal opinion would be the fact that porches would be something that's difficult to regulate, and I don't know that that's something worth regulating because it is an added construction cost. Not everyone may be spending as much time on the porches these days. I think, part of our goal is to try to get the community out there involved, right? Encourage involvement, participation in events, going to the beach. Now we're all short on time, right? I mean, in our busy lives. So I think requiring porches would be a very difficult task from my opinion.
I'm going to go off of that because it reminds me of something you said earlier where you said no other single-family homes have been regulated like that in Issaquah, but that's not the case because in the Highlands they have been. So I would recommend reaching out to see exactly how the Highlands have really developed because they have made a lot of strides for saying we want to have porches. It creates a community feel. So I would reach out to the association because they've had a lot of really good feedback from developers, from all the different projects that they've done of saying how did what we want actually get achieved? Because there have been pretty strict design guidelines that have been put on some of those buildings for better and for worse that they've experienced. And so I think they may have a pretty interesting situation to look at to how we can kind of model that.
That's a good example. I just, a lot of those that were put in place before anybody ever moved there. So people moved into that area knowing what they were getting into. But I think in Old Town, at least at my table at the meeting that we had, some of the people said we moved here because there is no HOA, and we do get to do what we want. And then somebody said, but it would be great to have a free HOA that we didn't have to pay into if somebody can regulate some of these things. So mixed feedback, but I do think a lot of people moved in here, and definitely, good to see how those regulations have worked with people on the single-family homes, but I think this is a different situation too, but certainly worth comparing the two. Yeah.
Is it even a factor? Thank you. Is it even a factor to consider energy efficiency in the materials that are desirable to use? And I honestly don't know the answer to that, but I know the city is trying to get toward carbon neutral eventually in the next century or whatever it is. And I'm not making light of that, but I know that is a city objective. So I don't know enough about building materials to know if that's something that should be considered in terms of we'd really like to see any new construction, whether it's remodeling or an entirely new building, from this range of materials. And one of the criteria for the selection of these materials is their energy efficiency.
We've talked about that, and Keith, who's hiding in the back, or Trish might be able to answer it better than me. I know that there's a sustainability plan that's in place that encourages right now, but does not, see, here he comes, but does not require, I don't know what the upfront costs are for that. And, I think that there are long-term benefits, but because the upfront costs, I don't know. Here, good.
Long way around.
It is.
Who asked this question? Oh, Randy. Hi, Andy. So right now, the city, as I think you all know, we're updating Title 18, the Land Use Code. Part of 2020 is also updating the building code. So the next round of building code updates needs to be adopted by the city in July. So there's a conversation right now through Office of Sustainability. They have a consultant named Cezanne. And Cezanne is looking through both our land use code and building code for opportunities to increase kind of our sustainable makeup. So I don't have an answer for you, but I can tell you people are thinking about that and looking at it right now.
When the Development Commission was working on the standards and guides that we did, one of the things that became very clear was there are two philosophies. One is to be very strict and prescriptive, and the other is to be not so strict and accept the fact that every once in a while somebody's going to come up with some kind of notion that you didn't plan for. And it's a great opportunity to be able to take a look at your standard and say, can we facilitate this or not? And so the specifics are not nearly as important as being able to step back and say, what's your overall goal and perspective? What are you really trying to accomplish? And so if you wanted to do a log cabin, for instance, in Old Town, I think there would be room for that, but I would really want to take a look at it and see how that fit into the context of where it was being built. So it's more about a context thing than worrying about whether the bricks are 12 inches or the logs are 5. I think that gets really nutso. Yeah. And so just acknowledge the fact that you're not going to cover every facet. And it's more important to be able to have enough flexibility so that you can create that environment where people can feel creative and at the same time not be so whacked out that they do something really weird. And that's really subjective. That really weird is subjective.
Yeah.
That's a good point, Richard. We like to refer that in our industry as prescriptive versus performance. So, looking at the overall performance of a building or a structure versus the individual elements, how does it perform as an overall? So I think there's definitely opportunities to, if one area is lacking, to compensate for other parts within the structure. So
Just a couple quick comments. So you said at the beginning that this is the only area in the city, residential, single-family residential neighborhoods that would have regulations, and that's what's being contemplated. And so when I was thinking about this, it's really thinking about Old Town and what do you want to preserve? What is the character, what are the elements of Old Town that you want to preserve as you look at it now? What are those things that you want to prevent? There are some things that have happened in the redevelopment that it's like, well, that's not really what we want to see continue. And then it's what do you want to encourage in the redevelopment? Because it's all redevelopment now. I mean, it's been built out for a long time. And so I think similar to the previous comment, it's, it will be prescriptive in a lot of ways. I think you need to be pretty selective at what you start with. You can't go in and regulate every element of a building, but you can talk about the scale, the massing of buildings and setbacks and things that are important, articulation in certain cases, garage locations. I think those are all really good, and you could start with more prescriptive approaches there. But you really do need to have general, kind of this is the character in the intent and the purpose and intent elements of the code that give more broad discretion, I think, on some of the other pieces to allow that kind of creativity to happen, but still give tools if things really kind of get off track for what you want to see, where staff or whoever the decision-making authority will be on the design has the ability to push back a little bit. And then if you're still getting things that aren't what we want to see happen as redevelopment occurs, you can tighten the regulations down a little bit. But I really would be careful about trying to get too detailed at the beginning of this process, because I think that could paint it into a corner, and you may get a lot of things that are not what we would like to see happen, or you could really throttle back reinvestment in that part of the city, and you don't want that to happen either. You want people to continue to invest in that property.
I'd like to also bring up an interesting point. I've heard many people talking about performance, building performance, sustainability, and character, and the eclecticness of the neighborhood. As emerging technology moves forward with renewable energies, we may be seeing things like solar panels on roofs, and I believe that's actually being deployed now in parts of Bellevue. What do we think about having solar panels on roofs in Old Town today? And then two, what if there was another option where if instead of having solar panels on roofs, where they could purchase higher credits with PSC and actually get the renewable energies from PSC as opposed to putting on these additional utility structures on their house?
Yeah, that might fall into the citywide sustainability, unless you're saying that you don't think we want to allow solar. But I didn't hear that in the community. I heard that they want to allow and even encourage some of those more sustainability metrics.
Right, but does the community know what that looks like? Because it is emerging tech, and there isn't anybody in Old Town that I'm aware of that has solar on the roof. But do we want houses with all these solar panels on the roof? What's the feel from that?
I think we need to find out. I think there's an aesthetic piece of that, but there's also a financial piece to that. And is it more important that people can, can pay for their energy bills every month because they've gone down because they're using solar panels, or is it more important that you don't have solar panels on the roof? But I think that's a question and something that needs to be brought up. This is our first public meeting as far as you guys go, so we've got lots of time and certainly could bring that up again. Yeah,
Picking up on
good
that
question.
comment, I wonder if you might consider a sustainability section for your manual somewhere. and just to get the conversation going, and maybe it refers to the code as it's updated or the city's sustainability initiative, so people would have a target to go to find the latest and greatest on that.
I'd just like to suggest something. I hear the word encouraged a lot. And from my perspective anyway, unless I understand what the word, is it not? Unless I understand what the word means, if I'm coming in with an application to build something, if I don't understand what the word means, then that causes me confusion. So I think with all the comments here, you can see the complexity of what we're trying to do here. And I'm still not sure I understand exactly what we're trying to do here. So if we start throwing in layers like using the word encourage, as opposed to incentivize with $1 limits attached, for example, then I think we cause confusion. So I think that is something we want to stay away from. Whatever we do here, whatever is done, I think wants to be, and we started out with this comment actually, clear and as best we can unambiguous to those who want to live here, who want to build here, and make Issaquah a home in one way or another. So encourage and words like that, they're not well defined.
Yeah.
Let's just suggest you
Yeah.
look at that.
No, I totally agree, and that's why we're thinking, especially for the single family, to start with what do we want to require or prohibit, and then we still have this long list of things that we want to encourage. So maybe in a year we'll revisit that list to see, are we missing anything? Do we want to add something? Because, and in the outline we talked about, the difference between intent, standards, and guidelines. And guidelines, there really aren't any teeth, but that's typically where you find that encourage. So it does add a lot of confusion to people, what they're required to do and what they're not required to do. So we can use, and I think we've been talking about that, we can use the intent statements to get at that and just not be overly prescriptive in terms of how people do it. So point's well taken. Any other topics? Move on. Talk about some other issues. Do you want to start with the gateway?
I don't know how far we'll make it with this topic, but we'll see. We started it internally, just staff, and it just kept going. And we said, let's see what the commissions think. So placemaking. In our existing standards, we actually have identified gateways into Old Town. And when we were doing our sub-area plan update, we tried to identify locations, but it never happened because particularly with the north and south, nobody could agree on where the north and south gateways for Old Town should be. So we're going to get your feel on it tonight because it says here, one of our policies, design gateway features to mark north, south, east, and west entrances to Old Town when public and private redevelopment opportunities occur. So the public and private is part of a discussion as well. So I'm going to skip that one. Where should they be located? We want some feedback on this. So right now, our north gateway is, actually it is considered to be at Gilman and Front Street, and right just above where Rainier crosses up there. There's actually a sign, however, that says "Welcome to Issaquah" as you get further down towards Dogwood, I believe it is, in the Rainier Front Street intersection, right in there. You've got Dairy Gold, which is a big landmark out there. You have the Mercantile Building. What is now, what is that called? Pardon me? Lazy Boy, yeah, Lazy Boy out there. And then you have smaller, things, like this is a house in here that is a commercial building as well. I think it's a nonprofit right there. So first of all, thoughts on where you think North Old Town begins? Yes. Where the north part of Old Town begins.
Thank you again. I think the operative word here is old. And we're going to forget the fact that I've got a problem with the E, but, so those buildings there, with the exception of the Lazy Boy, but certainly the Darigold, certainly the Mercantile Building, are some of the oldest buildings in Issaquah. So that seems to be kind of a starting point for me, that, that's the place where you start getting into old architecture. And the creek also goes right under, right under Front Street, Gilman, Front there. So that's kind of a natural, actually, for me, the creek is almost a defining factor all the way around there, especially on the west. So that's my 2 cents worth. That seems to me to be the beginning of Old Town, is where the old buildings start.
Sidebar. One of the task force recommendations was to remove the E from Old Town. And we brought it up during the plan update, and there was an uproar. Because old means old, and old E means character.
Is that
That was why, yes.
Well, the worst thing, only thing worse than that to me would be to have a sign that say hip. Because we got to tell people you're hip.
Thank you. Any other thoughts?
So if we were to put Old Town at the start of the creek, and a developer came in where there used to be a Shell gas station where the oil changing place is, and someone put in a modern high-rise, would that character would it make Old Town look like it's out of place? Because when you're coming into, how should I say it? Would it be out of character? As a question to my
Well,
commissioners.
So that's still in the cultural and business district. And if the new land use code regulations get passed, it won't be able to go above 40 feet or 3 stories, whichever is lower,
Okay.
whatever goes up there.
But the building character could be very different from that of Old Town.
They will still fall under the Old Town design standards because it's in the CBD.
Okay, so what we're defining here, maybe I'm confused. What we're defining is the start of Old Town, but not the Old Town design standards.
Old Town, it's a gateway sort of announcing, here we are. Go back 2 slides? You're going to make me figure out which way is back?
It's a symbolic hint to people who are driving into the area
Here.
that you're transitioning into a distinctive area.
So the current standards, these are some pages that deal with gateways. So it talks about it in 2 ways. And one is this public investment, so the arch or some, an art feature or something like that. And then one is in terms of the private development. So with the plan guidance, it was a little unclear how we wanted to interpret that into the standards, whether or not we want to keep this or if we want to focus it just on the public investment or the private. And I think what you were getting at is, does the architecture need to respond in a way? Can it or should it not when it's in this area? Is that what you were getting at in terms of?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. So if we say Old Town starts at, to Randy's point, the creek, then does that mean what's in front between the creek and Gilman, could that be out of character with Old Town and create a visual defect of sorts, right?
Yeah, and I think that's precisely what we're asking you. Are these the right locations? If it is, then how do we want to market? Do we want to have a departure like that, or do we want to steer away from the private side? So we've had a lot of discussion about it, and so that's why we were curious what you guys thought about what these gateways are and how we want to interpret them in the standards.
I'm a proponent of having that Front Street and Gilman being the beginning for the north entrance into Old Town. This is more from discussions that we've had on our commission over time, that we've come to kind of saying, how do we want to introduce people into Old Town? And we think about the neighbors that are around it. We think about the XXX, the Grange is down the street. We see a distinct character difference when you turn that corner. And I'm thinking right now that there's regularly a giant banner right there that's announcing what our next festival is. What are we doing? Trying to encourage people to say, hey, what's going on really in the heart of Old Town? And that starts right there. So I would encourage that before the creek, that even before you get there, because once you hit the creek and you hit the Dairygold, with the exception of the Lazy Boy, you are full into Old Town, in my opinion. So having that intersection to me is where it begins. And I think doing something that is large and visual, as we often have a banner, wouldn't be uncharacteristic as long as, again, it fit within a design standard. If you're looking to announce something and we want to say, this is Old Town, welcome, because again, you've already been in Issaquah most likely.
I just want to be clear. I wasn't saying the creek should be the boundary. I actually agree with Joy.
But it's a good
For long-
discussion to say where should that be,
Yeah.
and I think the creek is a natural one, so I like that as a discussion
No,
of giving
but I'm
another
just saying,
option.
I agree with you.
Yeah, yeah.
To me, the front in Gilman is actually where, it's the obvious entrance to Old Town. So I just mentioned the creek because that's kind of one of the defining characteristics out there.
I was thinking actually Dairygold until Joy just completely sold me on Front Street. So I'm actually now also for Front Street and Gilman. That seems like a good demarcation line.
But if we were to have a arch that says, welcome to Old Town, right at the point of Gilman, don't you think that'd be too soon?
Yeah, you could drop it back 50 feet or something.
I mean, I know it's semantics, but it's kind of like,
But the Grange and the Triple X, and I mean, even though I don't think it's technically part, it's still, that's when you start getting the feel of it.
Can I ask a question? Why is it important to have a designation, a clear delineation of something that's essentially amorphous and going to change over time? What's the point? I mean, it seems to me that one enters that, goes up, leaves Gilman and goes up Front Street. You already know. You don't have to be told something's different, unless you're blind and stupid, and that may be the case for a lot of people. But nonetheless, so I'm not sure how many angels can you fit in the head of a pin. I mean, where do we can have this discussion endlessly, and next year it might be something different because the milk, whatever they're called, has decided to move, or what, and that's a possibility, by the way, some of these, the way the world's going. So I'm just wondering if it really is a worthwhile discussion to have. It's an important one. I guess if everybody feels it is, then fine. I'm just raising the question. It wouldn't be important to me to be told when Old Town begins. I can figure it out.
Right, I think it's an identifier if you're new to town. I think, wayfinding has been a big topic in the city for a long time, and that's kind of a way of doing some wayfinding. And it just seems to be, since day one, things that people have wanted.
Okay.
We want to be identified.
Good enough.
I see part of it as a protection as well. We've had a lot of discussions about protecting Old Town and keeping it as a distinct place separate as we see development happening in Issaquah. And to us, in previous discussions, we've seen it as kind of creating a little bit of a bubble so that when you come into Old Town, you unmistakably know that it's different. It's not the same as other places in the city. We like that and we want to encourage it, and that kind of helps with that.
I think from a development standpoint, it's an iconic feature that introduces Issaquah as a old town, and it's like judging a book by its cover. If it's got a really nice entrance, people may be more likely to come in and have a better, more enjoyable time. It's about customer experience more than functionality, than a utility aspect, because there is no utilityness to it. It's marketing.
I'd like to
Here,
put
you
a
can
word
talk
in
about it.
for the bridge as being the location for it, because I think there are some very interesting, great historical aspects north, like the Triple X and Dairygold and so forth. But I don't know that those necessarily fit in what I would think of the character of Old Town. To me, is the more walkable Main Street type of Old Town, which I think is, to me, starts at the bridge and goes south. And I feel that's the walkable type of Main Street, whereas the Dairygold is sort of industrial, the Lazy Boy's now mid-century type of stuff. We've got bank branches and things like that. I like the historical buildings north of the bridge, but I feel, to me, the character of Old Town starts at the bridge and goes south.
I wanted to add some extra flavors into the conversation. Just as you're talking about where, I think it's helpful to talk about what as well. So we've collected some pictures just of different types of gateways. And we're not saying these are all appropriate or not appropriate for Old Town, but it's just categorizing different styles. So, something can be, what we've been talking about, these archways or the banners can be more this public investment. Is a type of gateway that can be over a street or a sidewalk. There can be prominent, ground sign that can announce to be another gateway. These are kind of literal gateways. Even there could be an art installation, again, can be another type of gateway. Or you can start talking, and we were starting to get this, you can just use prominent architectural features can be a gateway as well. Whether it's, massing that has a different shape, like this hexagon or however many sides that is, or something that's a departure from style. You have this glass shape right here that seems to be a departure that marks, a transition. Or you can have some sort of prominent blade sign, could arguably even be a gateway. Then the last type, and just in terms of what we're thinking, is even public spaces. The absence of a building or the absence of something could be another threshold or another transition. So I just wanted to run through those as we talk about locations, just because we're talking about what we want to write into the standards, which typically deal with the private property. So the question is, what are we going to require private developments to do if they're located in these gateway areas? So that's kind of the framing question to have. Got something? So with that, I'll go back to the north, or do you guys still want to talk about the specific north example? That where we were? And I think to ask it another way, we've talked about the banner, it seems like more of this discussion has been in this private realm, the public realm, in terms of public investment to mark the gateway. But then we've also talked about these buildings contribute to this sense of a threshold. So if a property was to redevelop in this area, do we want to have specific standards for that property? Or do we need to expand it or move that area? That's kind of the very specific question that we're looking for feedback on tonight. I know.
I think we're going to regulate to a fairly large extent the development that the private people can make. And it would seem more appropriate in my mind to have it be a municipal reliability or responsibility to be able to create that gateway sense, whether it's a banner or a statue or a water fountain or whatever it is. It just seems like the standards are going to dictate what the house is. It would seem pretty inappropriate to have them say, okay, now you have to put up a fountain or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
I think regulating the architecture of the gateways is important, whether it's at the north, east, south, west. I also had this kind of thought floating around of something that can be changed throughout the year, right? When we look at what we do at the, during Halloween, for example, or during, salmon days, something that can be transformed and evolved versus something just static, sitting there, getting dirty. And those are just kind of my thoughts on gateway in general, or types of gateways.
Yeah.
Well, he just mentioned the magic word as far as I'm concerned, that's salmon. Because we are, there are a lot of people in this town that are spending a lot of time and effort from the state level down to the county level, to the municipal level, to the private sector, to get greater understanding of the fact that there is a miracle that takes place in this city every year, and it's unique in the world. It's a mass migration that goes through the middle of a massive modern city, and there's no place else in the world that it happens, and it begins and ends right here. So if we're going to have something that announces your arrival into this place, I would suggest that it be something that is dedicated to the unique aspect of this place, and it happens to be in Old Town, and that's the hatchery, but the symbol is the salmon. And the more, I think, the more that we can do in Issaquah to address the long-term viability of this endangered species, the better.
You have a comment?
I completely agree that it's a municipal responsibility, and especially when we go back to things like signage, that it's something that I think we should involve the Arts Commission on as well. I think that doing something like some pictures you had on scale, that it's a combination of art, and art is something that represents Old Town and then also Issaquah as a city. And we really are proud of our salmon runs, and I think that it's something that it's a very nice way to integrate also the green space aspect of our character as well, and so I think there's a lot of play there to be done in an artistic way on a larger scale there on that northern side.
So just looking at the other locations, so this, you can see that there's a hatch which shows where the gateways are. So this is the west gateway, which might be a little more challenging, just in terms of what's there. So I guess the framing question is, do we want to treat this differently than the north? Do you think there should be some municipal-led gateway here, or some additional standards for private redevelopment that happens at this intersection?
Seems like that one could be more like a rock, right? You know, it's like, so,
I
you
agree.
know, it's, there's not enough traffic there. There's really no place to put anything.
I see
so,
something that's
again,
less in scale, but we have the creek there, right there, so it really is, to me, a very symbolic place. You're about to hit the hatchery, so to me, I would call it more a piece of art rather than arch. I think to me, the scale is a difference here, but I wouldn't negate it, coming off of Newport there. You do kind of, you have a big shift too as you're coming in. You have the low-rise apartments into the library. I mean, it's a very different feel than Newport, and so I think calling it out is completely appropriate.
But rather than maybe calling out a specific gateway to that area, the fish hatchery is there, and maybe using the fish hatchery itself with either a statue or something like that, because you had a couple pictures that might be good examples. Use something at the fish hatchery to announce that you are coming into the fish hatchery, and that would be the gateway to the west side of Issaquah. And it would be a marker to let people know that there's something special there.
And I would, for me, I would have the city put an arch over the bridge here and over the bridge at the north end of town, and both those arches have artistic salmon going, because that's what's happening underneath you as you go through there, is a salmon flowing through. Have an arch there, welcome to Old Town. It's got the salmon. They're both the same locations, essentially where Salmon Days booths and so forth end at those bridges. Or you don't really have booths all the way up to the north, but to me, that would be at those two entrances, you could have city artwork celebrating the salmon, reminding people you're going over a bridge that has salmon underneath it, so.
So I think it's a combination. I think it is an arch or some major feature, but it also is a combination of what is the design standard for the buildings that'll be constructed there. Because if you think about when you're entering, you're transitioning to a different place, the look and feel is different. It's not just a sign. That doesn't make the experience different. It's about what's happening around you that makes the experience different. So you do need to have something that's kind of a marker. It could be an arch or a piece of art or something that's reflective of the community's values and interests. But it's also thinking about what's happening with architecture and redevelopment that will happen over time. So you could require open space or a small plaza that has something that is a place where people could gather, or you're integrating art into it, or a specific feature of the building that is of gateway in nature. You don't have to be real specific there, but saying it needs to be something that is, a demarker from transitioning from one part of the city into another. So I think it's more than just posting a sign or, a piece of art. It's a combination of things that actually makes a gateway, really a gateway, a transition to a new place.
So on the east side, right now in the standards, it's just this little one property right there that's designated the gateway. And right now it's this vacant looking parcel.
Kind of a
Is
parking
there,
lot for the
is the
trailhead.
thinking, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, I think it's kind of used as a parking lot for the trailhead right now.
So is the thinking that these gateways should be different, each one should be different, or should there be a common design theme? Is there one message that we're trying to convey to everybody that comes into Old Town through these various gateways? And I happen to think that there ought to be a theme for all of them, whatever that is. Obviously, I think salmon. But I'd be a little bit, I don't know, I guess I'm not comfortable with different, they can be different medium, maybe a standard in one place or an arch in another, but I think the message has to be the same.
So, and
for all of them.
I'm sorry, I don't know if you're familiar with them, but in Old Town, several years ago, we had an artist make bike racks for us, and they all represent different elements of Old Town. And one represents the water. It's kind of a pebble fell in the water, and it's the ripples. Another one represents, it's a fern, different ferns in it, so it represents the greenery and the trailheads. And the last one, took me a while, is a thumbprint, but for the people who live here. But they're all made out of the same materials, they're the same shape, they're all related, but they represent different parts of Old Town. Is that kind of where you're going with they need to be similar and
Well,
idea?
first place, I like Joy's idea of getting the Arts Commission involved in this. I mean, I'm really leery of bureaucrats, with all due respect, deciding what art is going to be. So I think that's a really good addition to it. But if there is one defining thing for this place, it seems to me to be the salmon. And so if we're going to have different messages or different symbols on the different gateways, that doesn't seem to be as effective to me as having the same symbol, regardless of whether, again, if it's an arch or a rock with a salmon carved into it or something like that. But this Old Town is where this takes place, and this is really our identity, and it's part of the curriculum for the school district. And
Yeah, to Randy's point, what's the theme?
I think right now there is no theme, and
Exactly.
the reason why we brought this up is because there's plan guidance to deal with this, and then in the existing standards, it actually calls out parcels to say these are gateways, the design should respond. And so we were looking at it saying, is this something we want to carry over into the updated guideline or standards, and then looking at the plan that it wasn't that specific. We thought it was valuable to have that conversation and get your feedback. And what I'm hearing is this is probably more suited to, Arts Commission having some more, cohesive discussion about what these are, rather than codifying them in terms of actual standards and guidelines to, what needs to happen.
And I know you're going to go to public comment, I mean, not here, but public feedback in terms of what the theme should be. But getting the different commissions, like the Parks Commission, the Arts Commission, DIA, involved in trying to come up with, what is the theme of Issaquah? What do we want to brand ourselves as? And then use that as the gateway themes, And that may actually dictate what these archways are going to be. We may have more than one style of archway, but I think the point we need to figure out is where do we want gateways rather than what do we want them to look like at this phase? Because we don't know what it's going to look like because we haven't even decided what our branding is going to be yet.
And it's even probably another step like up. Whereas, do you want the gateway to be a public project where it's in the public right-of-way and it's publicly funded and it goes through the Arts Commission? Or do you want to create additional standards for the private development to support or mark that gateway? And I think right now, the current standards say if there is a public gateway, then the building or the architecture should respond to it. But it doesn't necessarily say the building doesn't have to be the gateway. So we're just trying to figure out how do we want to codify this topic. Yeah.
Yeah, the way I think this is going to work, actually, is that it is our responsibility to recommend to the mayor and the council, the PPC, what we think things as big as the themes ought to be. So and I don't know if Joy had this in mind, but I didn't intend to imply that the Arts Commission should decide what the theme is. I think that should come to them, and then they would do their recommendations to the council and the mayor, and maybe even come back through a public hearing with the PPC. But I think that's the city, that's our job to recommend what we think the theme of the gateways should be, and whether or not it should be one, a different one for each gateway or one that's reinforced by all of them. So.
And I wonder if we're talking really about gateways for this particular sub-area or gateways for Issaquah. Will the other sub-areas then have defined gateways just like this? Are we multiplying lots of gateways here, or are we really talking about what's symbolic and brand significant for Issaquah?
Yeah, that's a good point, because maybe we want, if we get ST3 coming into town and we have a bridge going over the freeway, maybe that becomes the gateway to Issaquah. And then we have a gateway to Old Town, which is different. It's a sub-marketing. It's an area of town that we're going to market differently than we would Issaquah.
Do you mind going back to the east real quick? I think one thing we haven't touched on specifically to the Easterly Gateway is that a lot of people are coming into our community from there and are moving through, okay? And they're coming through a pretty sensitive part of Old Town. So I unfortunately had to miss the traffic calming meeting that was in the Eagle Room prior to this, but we all know that coming into these neighborhoods, we want to give the impression that you are in a special place. Please slow down. So this gateway is actually services in a different way. Rather than kind of saying this is who we are in character, it also has a function. It also has a function because of where it's situated, right next to coming off of the 90, people coming in, again, through other communities, through the Highlands, and passing through. And right now, the way that you kind of get that is a flashing sign telling you you're going over 25. So wouldn't it be nice if we said that in a different way? So gateways can also be functional. They can also encourage safety. They don't also, they can be beautiful. It can be a big piece of basalt that we can see how often truckers hit. I mean, I think there can be a lot of things, but it can also be a functional way to help communicate to drivers that you are entering a place that is different than where you've been. And so I think that for the East, that's a very important thing to think about as we design something for that space.
Can I ask, in all your discussions, your public meetings, where you've had public input, we've talked about theme here, and we were posing some of our ideas, if you will, on discussion. Have you been given, or can you collate ideas coming from those who live in the area, but what it means to be in Old Town? Have you got themes that we could play off of and say, that's what it means to those who live here or come through here regularly? Right now, I feel rather divorced from that whole we're kind of in isolation here, talking in a room about what a theme should be.
Yeah, we haven't heard any
Nothing?
themes
Have you
yet.
asked?
No, and we haven't asked. Yeah, and we haven't asked. That would be a good reason why. So I look forward to hearing something tonight. Most of our discussions recently have been on the single-family areas because that's so new to us.
Right.
And we want people to be sure that they're comfortable with what happens to their houses.
Right.
So that's been the primary discussion there, but I look forward to hearing it during the,
But
maybe
if we
hopefully
talk
during
about
public
a
comments,
theme,
people,
Per Ron's comment, how do we can't back into that.
Right.
Without
Right.
those who live here having a very strong voice in what that live here in Old Town, I mean.
right.
I think we're getting cart before the horse here to a certain extent, quite frankly.
Yeah, I agree, and it seems like that there would be value in having a discussion just around this topic that's separate from the standards. And I think from how the plan policy is written, it's a little vague to where there's a disconnect between the actual standards and the policy that I think having a broader discussion maybe with other commissions as well to see, and, coupling it with the traffic calming, I think is a great idea. So I think we can brainstorm as a project team, and the next time we come back, we can have some, steps to how we can do this to get people's involvement as well, because I don't want us to pretend like we're coming up with the theme for the gateways tonight, and I think it's, much more important of a conversation.
I just want, to Richard's comment, I personally don't see gateways hither, thither, and yon. I mean, it seems to me that what we're doing here today is Old Town and helping people understand Old Town as opposed to the commercial district or the central district or the Highlands or something like that. I think that's a really good question. It's an obvious question, but my take on that would be, no, if we're going to do gateways, it's just going to be, and the East Gateway, frankly, and the North Gateway are so close to 90 that they function as welcome to Issaquah markers anyway, so.
And this is from the Old Town plan,
Yeah.
So the city policy is specific to Old Town too, so.
One comment, I guess in answer to your question about should we have those properties be zoned that way or the requirements, my thought would be that to keep those, but as allowing them to have gateway features that might be different than the rest of Old Town, but not requiring them to have gateway features and make them be forced to have a public announcement on their property. The city wants to put up signage, artwork, that can be what they do. If these people want to incorporate it in those locations, allow them to do that.
So, quick question to that, because I like where he's going with that. What if we did a co-branding effort with a landowner who wanted to develop a building, and we'd say, we want to build an archway, we want this to be a gateway, we would throw money to you to help you build a building that would be a gateway to our community, and that way we get something and they get something, and the end product is we get a great gateway experience. Right? So I think that might be a good solution, but I think the buildings need to match sort of the gateway experience.
Yeah. The last gateway before we move on, just to close this conversation, is South Gateway, the pool area. So that definitely has a different look and feel and character, but I think we can move on to ADUs and additions if we've discussed this enough. All right. So to start with additions, I think the framing conversation here is what size or what amount of value of addition should respond to the standards. Does every addition need to abide by the standards, or is there some threshold? So that's, I think, the highest level question we have for you. I think it's the zoning right now that has a value. So if it's 50% of the value of the property, then you have to come into compliance with.
To the best extent possible.
To the best extent possible.
Is it central Issaquah?
So that's just kind of a starting point to think about. Does that make sense to look at this from a value perspective, or Do you want to think about additions in terms of square feet or presence on the street? And this example over here, these were just, if you go back in Google Street View, I think this is from, 2008 or something, and then it's the same property now. So you can see what, one property has done already where, it pops the top and expands. So how do we want to deal with additions? I'll run through some pictures just to frame these questions a bit more. So when we talk about additions, do you want to have any sort of character or stylistic standards to the addition? So for example, these two pictures are houses that were added onto, but it was done in a way that it appears to be one cohesive design. Whereas this option down here, you could see that the ground floor had one character and style, and then the addition has a completely different look and feel. So that's up for discussion, how we want to manage this and regulate it. Did you want to add something?
Well, I was going back to the plywood example. Say there's an existing house that's sitting there and it's made of plywood. Is it best for the addition to come in and keep the consistent character of the existing house and use plywood? Or do they need to comply with something that is allowed as a material and do, I don't know materials, so I'm looking to you. It's something else that would be allowed. Say if, that's just another consideration there as part of the additions, I think.
I believe that the architectural standards are going to define the character and the context of the facility. And so rather than worry about a square foot, it would seem more appropriate to me to say if you've changed the context or character, you need to comply. The point is to maintain that eclectic character. And so I could see where you could add a 10 by 10 garage on the front of your house. That's not what you want. You could put a 10 by 10 garage on the back of your house and you haven't changed the context or character, and it seems like that would be more than appropriate, right? So yeah. I don't know that I think it would be really perilous to go down the square foot.
Yeah, so you're thinking more if it's visible from the street, that might be one threshold. If for instance, if it's on the side of a house, then that might be more conducive to standards rather than if it's behind it, too.
It seemed when I was on the walk, the horrible wet Saturday walk, and the discussions at my table, anyway, the table I was at, were all about what was visible from the front. There was some discussion of the alley and where to have the garage, but everything else was, I think, really about the image from the front. So if we followed along with that theme, then perhaps that's a way to solve this problem, is to focus on the front, and maybe the side could be more, the treatment of the sides could be more flexible. It doesn't get to the plywood issue, but it does at least say the focus is on that image from the street image.
Yeah.
That seems to be the way we were talking at that.
I would almost treat all sides equally. I think it's important to keep in mind the neighbors, obviously, what's being affected on their end. Just a clarification, Samantha, on that, the 50% value, so currently as it stands, less than 50% value, design standards don't apply? Is that correct? Or
that's for zoning, right?
Well, no, that's,
Because right now there are no standards.
there's no standards?
Yes.
Right.
So
Yes.
nothing applies
Right.
now? Okay, okay.
So once we have standards, then that's the question.
Yeah.
Should they apply or not? Is that even the right metric?
Okay.
Or do we want to have other criteria?
I'm in agreement to try to keep things uniform, based on the style and the standards. I think seeing 2-3 houses stitched together isn't quite pleasing. I've actually seen a few developments like that in Seattle, and I always wonder as I walk past them what the reasoning was. But I think, back to that conversation, I think it's important to be mindful of all elevations, all sides of a building, whether it's an alley, street, or your adjacent neighbor.
so when you say keep things uniform, keep them uniform with what's existing, or bring things into compliance so that they're all uniform with standards?
It's a good question. I think a good question. Got to think about that one. They come back.
So like the point being, if they were to like re-side their house, and they added an addition, then they would re-side their whole house with that material. But if they didn't want to cover the expenses, then they would have to comply with matching what's already existing.
Right.
Something like that.
Right.
Because to the point about stitching them together, those pictures are horrifying.
Yeah, I agree. I think continuity is really important here, and especially because right now we're talking about additions, which makes it really easy on the eye. I think there was an image you had of number 4 where you have this Tudor and the modern, and it makes me cringe a little bit. And so, but let's move to me, the hypothetical then moves to ADUs, which is something we want to encourage, okay? It's important that we build these in a way where we're not saying you have to build a Tudor, but they should have to pick one or the other. So if we decide that we are not going to say that once you do an addition that you now need to fit to the design standards, if we don't go that path, then we need to think about ADUs as saying there needs to be continuity to the property so that there again isn't all this hodgepodge collected just crammed into these little spaces, which is easy to do when you think about, hey, how cheaply can I put a little shed on, a little heater if I run, I mean, how basic and minimum can we get when you start, I'm gonna add a composting toilet. I mean, you can start building ADUs in a way that can really change the character of a neighborhood. And we've seen in Seattle, there's been a big uproar to that for the very reason of this 4 sides concept that we're in a community, we are neighbors, we do share fences and walls, and so there has to be some sort of what exists in place and how do you match that, because not every home does look the same. And so there needs to be a character that gets preserved per property as well.
So I just wanted to make sure we're clear. So most likely, if we adopt standards for architecture for single family, most of the homes are not going to comply completely. So in some way, shape, or form, they will probably be out of compliance with the new standards. So if you do an addition, the choices are either the addition doesn't comply because we want it to be consistent with the existing non-compliant house, or you make the addition comply, which now makes it not exactly match the existing house, or you say you now have to, if you want to do an addition, you now have to make your house comply. So those are your 3 choices, and obviously there's a fiscal impact to whichever one of those choices you want to pick, but you need to think about the cost and the aesthetics when you think about those 3 choices. So I just want to make sure that you guys were thinking about that holistically.
Keith, can I ask you, just for clarification, homeowners in this area now that want to make a change or an addition to their property, they have to go to the city. Would you define what the jurisdiction is in terms, because as I recall, and I just asked Richard this, you don't, if you're a homeowner and you want to put an addition on your house or you want to remodel it or whatever, it doesn't come before the Development Commission. It's already on platted land, so this is not a DC level issue. So I just think that needs to be kind of clarified.
So right now in Old Town, so this is where we have some different rules in different parts of the city. But in the Highlands, if you want to do an addition, there is an architectural review committee, as Joy alluded to earlier. It's not city-run. It's administered through the covenants and the community association of the Highlands. Tallis has the same thing. For Old Town, if you want to do an addition, you bring your plans into City Hall Northwest. We review them against zoning code only. We don't judge aesthetics, and you get your permit based on that. This would add a new layer, and we haven't even talked about, if we were to do this, who's going to then be the czar of aesthetics for Old Town? That's a whole other conversation, which we would need to figure out at some point.
So this is a question to Keith. So before Randy's question, what would be your recommendation for how to handle this? Because if I was a landowner in Old Town, and that might be soon, and if I wanted to either convert a house or add an addition to an existing house, then from a cost standpoint, am I going to have to bring the whole house up to standard or just the addition? I mean, because you start changing the whole house, now you have a huge cost burden that you may not be able to
Right,
afford.
it's a huge impediment to people expanding in place. So that's, if you guys are pointed in that direction, we're going to have a serious conversation about the limitations that would put on Old Town residents. And you know, we could probably do a straw vote today, and I am going to guess most of you would probably land in the right space, but we can talk about that. That's part of that equation. If we want to just go down the rabbit hole for a second on who might review these guidelines and compliance with these guidelines, again, I'm not going to suggest a preferred alternative. I'm going to say that there are choices. The first choice would be we could choose Development Commission. Okay, that's one choice.
Are we going to vote on that?
No. Second choice would be staff. Third choice is, you know, we could try to organize an Old Town Architecture Review Committee that would be made up of residents who live in Old Town. That would be on parallel with like the Highlands and Tallis, where people who live there would actually form a committee, and everything would then run through them. So there's choices. We would have to, you know, at some point later on, we'll talk about, you know, if there's a preferred recommendation from this group on which one of those choices make the most sense. But there's choices. So I think there's choices on how additions are handled, and additions would include ADUs. There's choices on who ultimately is the reviewing body. So those are things that, again, as we start to, and part of some of those decisions, Ron, I think will become maybe clearer depending on how far down the totem pole we want to regulate. I mean, if all we're doing is regulating no flat roofs and, you know, it's going to be one of these colors, that's fairly easy. And you guys might say, well, staff can do that. That's a check the box kind of thing. The farther down the totem pole we get, the more it's, I'm going to suggest it's not staff. And then we're going to need to talk, Richard, about DC, because if it's a huge workload item, how's DC going to manage that, right? So those are some of the nuances we're going to have to talk about when we get to the right space.
Just a quick follow-up comment. So I appreciate Keith's comments. So without having the regulations in place, it's kind of hard to make some judgments here about a threshold. But also just thinking about, back to my original comment, how much of what we have in Old Town do we want to see change, and how much of it do we want to preserve? If we're pretty comfortable with what we've got there, then when it comes to additions and remodels to buildings, maintaining the architectural style or compatibility is probably fine. But if we want to start to kind of push the buildings to whatever the new standard is, then you want to set a threshold that says, well, when you trip this threshold, 50% of the value or 50% of the building area or whatever the choice is, it drives the new regulation. It says now you need to upgrade your property to comply with our new standards. So I think part of it is a bit of a judgment call, and that will really be driven by what the level of regulation is that's decided on here, I think. And as far as the where, just since I've got the microphone, where it goes, Development Commission, we're pretty busy. So I'm thinking maybe planning and policy. How busy are you guys? So I think staff, clearly this is a staff level, would be my recommendation. Again, it depends on the level of regulation. The next choice would be you have the community help regulate itself in that particular part of the city. So those would be my suggestions.
Can I jump in real quick with something? So to go off of Michael's comment, something I was interested about our meeting tonight was this kind of cross dialogue between our commissions. So we had part of the responsibility of designating you guys as the person to take over UVDC, and as we grandfathered in these parts of the city and said, well, you know, can't, you know, to city staff saying what and where can this be absorbed, and you guys got that. And I think it's an interesting question to say, how has your workload changed, and how have you guys found that it's been helpful as we've put in these design standards? It was a big deal, a lot of work went into it, and it kind of having this perspective from you guys of saying, is this working? How are you guys actually finding that doing something like we're trying to do in Old Town has made a difference? I'd be curious to see from your guys' standpoint, you know, we work on the code, but you guys got to live with it. So how has been living with it been?
Last year, we had 19 meetings for Shelterwood. One just about every other week, and so it's hard. It's just been one project, and the consequence was that it was a big workload. I think it's hard to really make an evaluation because that was such a dominant piece of work.
And I do think the Evergreen Ford dealership was an interesting test case for us, certainly because it was, in terms of the Central Issaquah design standards, trying to fit that into a car dealership in the location they were in. It was not the easiest one to work with, so, for anybody.
And the Gilman Lofts project was another interesting application there because it wasn't exactly specifically to guidelines, but it was an interesting creative spin on one of the architectural styles that we had, Urban Grange. So I think it was very helpful to have that style in place.
And I would just add that I think because of the work that we did on the standards and guides for the Development Commission, we are way far ahead of getting what we want. And so I just encourage that. That process is really important, and it really boils down to acknowledging that you can be really specific or not quite so specific, and having that dialogue, because when you're not so specific, you end up having to talk about it more. And making some trade-offs of whether it really meets and complies with what you want to do or not. But the standard, having a standard, an appropriate, inappropriate kind of standard really, really is helpful.
Do you have examples from other towns where you're starting with an area that's, in its essence, diverse, and trying to think through whether or not to impose some lack of diversity to it? Do you have other examples that might help us think about some of these questions, which there's no defined answer. It's a judgment call, and it would be very helpful to have other experiences from other places and the results of the processes they went through. That, to me, anyway, would be very helpful.
Yeah, a lot of the examples I have are really specific to solving a specific problem. Like there were a lot of demolitions, or it's in a historic district, or it's an area that's not seeing any development. So then we use this as a tool to then incentivize and start to guide development. So Old Town is unique in a certain way, but I think what I'm hearing is really getting very clear about what is the most important aspects to maintain the character and focus on getting those right, instead of having all this fluffy, ambiguous, guidelines that then turn into a judgment call and prolong the process. And then I like the plan of revisiting it in a year to see if it's working or if it's not, if we want to tighten things up or not. But I think what I'm hearing, and I know I can speak for staff, is we don't want to create this really long, drawn-out process for anybody, for the homeowners, for the designers, for staff, for you guys. But we want to make sure that we still protect and preserve what is most valuable about Old Town.
Yeah, and just for a minute to come back to Commissioner Brennan's statement regarding identify very high level, what are the aspects that you really are looking to preserve, and if those become your guiding principles and you test every single intent statement against that, then maybe, you can really drive consistency through what you're trying to do.
A good discussion. Thank you all for coming and participating as much as you did. I'm going to follow the agenda, but I'm going to be very efficient. I think that's what we have for tonight. Next, this all blends together. Let's see. Next steps. So on February 25th, we are taking this same type of discussion to the City Council. We'll also be talking about the proposed land use code amendments that night, and then we're going to move straight into this discussion and let them know same things that you heard, except that we will also include this conversation and let them know what we heard here and get their feedback on it as well. We are not expected to put a draft out there until June 4th, It'll be out there for public review, and then we start that public process. On June 11th, we're going to have another joint Development Commission and Planning Policy Commission meeting. We may have another meeting in there to talk about these. And then July 19th, we're expected to have a public hearing. The 11th would be a council study session, and then these will be adopted as part of the Title 18 update. It'll be incorporated into that. We'll have a complete document for you all to look at and to make a recommendation on, but it'll be incorporated into Title 18. That is the proposed schedule. I think that's all. I think that covers all the announcements. Any other things that we have? That means it's finally time for audience comments. So when you come up, if you would just give us your name, that's all we need. That'd be great. Any takers? Oh, that's right. I changed it one, but not the other. July, I think it's 23rd.
Hello, I'm Bill Freisinger. I live in Old Town on Bush Street.
Changed it one. I forgot.
In the initial discussion, you said you were going to concentrate on, you have two categories, because I have suggestions and requireds, and talked as if they're going to deal initially with this required. Then it sounded like most of the stuff was sort of suggestion-y. My particular concern is the color requirements. You showed an example of the kind of rainbow house. Actually, I'd be perfectly fine if you could say, well, you can use one color in that rainbow house as the main color and the other one is an accent color. That would really be all right. But it's nothing like the sort of earth tones you were talking about. So I guess I want to emphasize that I want a fairly wide choice in colors. Maybe if it's outside of something, rather you go through some review process or something like that. But anyway, a little bit of flexibility there. The spelling of Old Town, by the way, I'm a horrible speller. And if there isn't a consistent way to do it, I have even more problems. I mean, I was trying to figure out what was going on in Old Town, so I Googled Old Town and didn't get anything, because I wasn't spelling town right. Or was it old? Anyway, I wasn't spelling one of the words right. And that's just a personal view on that. Thank you very much.
Good evening. My name is Ryan Yee, and my wife and I own a property right on Sunset Way, just off 2nd, 245 Sunset Way. We have been in the last year looking at trying to redevelop the entire property. The property currently used is as a acupuncture office for my wife and massage therapy. Many of you drive past it, Better Health at Sunset. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for all of you that volunteer your time for the Design Commission. I know in my volunteer work that I do, it takes an awful lot of hours and awful lot of effort, so I really appreciate it. I'd like to know how many of you, anyone else that lives in Old Town in the area? Okay, great. Any of you live directly on Front Street or Sunset Way? Great. One of the questions I really had for the Design Commission and the city was, those Front Street and Sunset Way really are completely different in the aspect that they are part business, part private ownership. Our, looking at our property for redevelopment, we wanted to maintain the acupuncture practice there in the city, but also live above it. And a lot of building codes I know have gone away from that, where there's no longer families living above their business. And one of the questions I had is, what exactly do you want to attract on those two main streets of those businesses? They're all small businesses. We don't have $1 million building development funds. We can't build huge complexes. I'm in the construction business myself. I do remodels on residential and commercial buildings. And I realize anytime I go down to the city on a permit and said, we would like to add the kitchen into incorporate it into our build. and realized that we just told the homeowner and the city that we're adding somewhere between $10,000 and $40,000 to their cost of the project all of a sudden, because of whatever codes we need to bring things up to or additions that we have to have. Well, I also ask you to take a look at, again, your front view aspect rather than just your all-around view aspect. One of the thoughts we looked at in concept was having a rooftop deck on the back side of the three-story house. Yet, if we were required to keep a four view or all four aspect sides, we would have to have a pitched roof, something along those lines. So we look at this, and those decisions that you make, is the flexibility is truly important. Especially as I see, does anyone else on the design commission come from a Asian or African ethnic background that wants to incorporate cultural aspects into their business, their building, their restaurant? Feng shui, architect attitudes that we want to consider. I know that we have a Japanese spa in the middle of Old Town, and I know that Japanese look probably doesn't fit the criteria of what we have for general Old Town standards. But I really encourage, yes, keep it as recommendations, leave a lot of flexibility. For what we're faced with is quite immense. I know I was probably 10 years back, recognize Michael from when I came upon the approval for just the front signage of our business. And we had quite a few fun questions just trying to get through, is this the minimum that we need just to have a sign, and does it really work? We also approached and looked and said, hey, we might want to have some sort of ramp access from Sunset onto our property as a business. But found out that that triggered a traffic concurrency study and report in excess of $20,000 to build a 25-foot long, 3-foot wide ramp. So as we get into this development, especially the businesses along front Sunset Way, these family businesses really have to take a look at how they want to best use it. The code changes are important. The parking lot or parking requirement changes that we face, for instance, right now we face for every 200 feet of office space, we have to have a parking space. And when you're looking at being able to increase to 75% usage of the space, which is what's being proposed, it's a tremendous benefit, but what would be a better benefit for us is not having to have as many required parking spaces for that square footage. So instead of 200, maybe increasing it to 300 or 400 square feet of parking, because we really don't use that much parking, but we're going to be required to put it in. Thank you for your time. I'm more than happy to answer any questions or comments, and we'd love to stay involved. I don't know the exact date when the code changes may actually get voted and approved, but we're waiting to make those decisions on our plans as soon as those do happen. Thank you.
Is there anyone else who'd like to speak? Anyone else? Is there anyone else who'd like to speak? All right.
The opportunity is rapidly going. So in regard to the whole discussion about Old Town, I guess I'm always reminded when people start talking about spelling of my favorite quote from Mark Twain, and he says, never trust anybody that can only spell a word one way. Being challenged that way my whole life, it's been refreshing. So we appreciate the public taking the time to make comment, and the dialogue was really excellent. And so at this point, let's consider ourselves adjourned.